29-year-old Satoru leads a dreary life. Since his passion to work as a manga artist does not suffice to make ends meet, he also earns a living as a pizza delivery boy. Satoru's life may seem ordinary, but he has an extraordinary gift. Every now and then, he experiences a phenomenon he calls revival. It occurs when Satoru finds himself on the verge of a tragedy. He is then sent back a few minutes in time, and thereby given the opportunity to prevent the disaster. The revival moments happen quickly and unexpectedly. This is also the case on a seemingly ordinary day while Satoru is delivering pizza. After experiencing a revival, he notices an unconscious truck driver who is about to hit a child on the street. Satoru is able to save the child at the last moment, but is hit by the truck himself during the rescue. He later wakes up in the hospital with his colleague Irie by his side, who praises him for his courage in saving the child. After Satoru is discharged from the hospital, he finds his mother Sachiko in his apartment, cooking him a tasty dinner. Much to Satoru's displeasure, she announces that she plans on staying with Satoru for a while to support him after the accident. During their dinner conversation, Sachiko reminds Satoru of the appalling events that happened in his childhood. When he was 10 years old, their town was hit by a series of cruel kidnappings and murders. A total of 3 children disappeared, and Satoru's trusted friend, the then 20-year-old Yuki, was convicted for the deeds. When Satoru and Sachiko visit a local shopping center a few days later, Satoru experiences his next revival. He alerts his mother that something seems to be wrong, and Sachiko inadvertently manages to prevent the abduction of a little girl by making eye contact with her almost kidnapper. Sachiko ponders over the incident for a while, as the supposed kidnapper seemed to be familiar to her. She finally concludes that she knew who he was, and the witnessed events indicate that he's likely the real perpetrator from the kidnappings that happened 18 years ago. At home, she eagerly awaits Satoru to inform him about her revelation. However, an unknown man suddenly breaks into the apartment and stabs Sachiko to death before she can share her suspicions. When Satoru comes home and finds his mother's lifeless body, he falls to his knees and sees the knife in her. Suddenly, his neighbor stands in the doorway, sees Satoru with blood-smeared hands, and calls the police in panic. The police arrive to arrest Satoru for his mother's murder, but Satoru manages to escape. He distraughtly runs down the street until he suddenly finds himself in a strange environment. When Satoru regains full consciousness, he realizes that he had just experienced a very long revival. He's back in his hometown, but as a 10-year-old boy in 1988, the year of the kidnappings. After his initial confusion, he determines that the purpose of this absurd situation is that he was given a second chance to prevent multiple terrible tragedies: the kidnappings of the 3 children in 1988 and the murder of his mother. Satoru is overjoyed to see his mother back home and immediately sets out to prevent the first kidnapping of his classmate Kayo. He decides that the best way to protect Kayo is to make friends with her. However, he soon realizes that Kayo doesn't have an easy life at home, which is evident by her reserved nature and the bruises on her legs. Satoru's friend Kenya is impressed with Satoru's efforts to befriend Kayo and points him to a text she has written. The text, titled "The Town Where Only I Am Missing," is a heartbreaking story that hints at Kayo's difficult life and the terrible abuse she receives from her mother on a daily basis. Thereupon, Satoru invites Kayo to his upcoming birthday party and learns that Kayo's birthday is the same day as his, March 2nd. Since Satoru remembers that Kayo was still 10 years old when she disappeared in March 1988, he realizes the 1st of March must be Day X, the day her kidnapping takes place. That gives Satoru exactly 11 days to change the course of events. When looking for Kayo in the park, Satoru meets Yuki again and spends a fun afternoon with him, which further strengthens his conviction that there is no way the good-natured young man could be a cruel murderer. This now gives Satoru another person to save from the tragic events: Yuki, who's awaiting the death penalty in Satoru's present, the year 2006. When Satoru later continues his search for Kayo at her house, he finds her cowering on the floor of her shed, scantily clad and covered in bruises. A few moments later, however, her mother Akemi finds the two of them, orders Kayo back into the house, and sends Satoru home. The next day, Satoru talks to his teacher Yashiru, who reveals that he had also suspected Kayo's abuse by her mother for some time already, but has so far tried in vain to get the youth welfare office involved. Later in class, Kayo is accused by her classmate Misato of stealing the students' lunch money. But Satoru and Yashiro are quickly able to put an end to the false accusations. In the evening, Satoru has a special surprise for Kayo. He takes her for a walk through the forest until they come across a mighty Christmas tree and marvel at it while holding hands under the bright starry sky. A few days before the abduction date, Satoru invites Kayo to the local science center to spend the day with her, thus keeping her away from her mother. While strolling through the science center, Satoru experiences a strange sense of déjà vu and suddenly remembers that he was also there 18 years ago. The following Tuesday is Day X. Satoru spends the whole day with Kayo at the youth center and then accompanies her home in the evening. During the night, Satoru watches Kayo's house and is relieved when the clock strikes midnight with no major events. The next day, while Satoru and Kayo go shopping for their birthday party, Satoru experiences another déjà vu at the supermarket. At home, the two birthday children are warmly welcomed by their friends and Sachiko and spend a merry celebration together. Satoru falls asleep, happy and relieved. He seems to have indeed been successful in changing the future and averting tragedy. The next day, Satoru rushes to school after oversleeping. To his great shock, he finds that Kayo is not there. Satoru is distraught by the fact that he could not prevent Kayo's disappearance, but apparently only delay it by 2 days. 6 days later, the second victim, Aya, a girl from the neighboring school, also disappears. The incidents from 18 years ago seem to be happening in an almost identical way for a second time. When Satoru passes Kayo's house a few days later, he watches Akemi lovelessly disposing of Kayo's belongings. Desperation rises in him, and he runs hysterically down the street, until he suddenly finds himself back in 2006 as a 29-year-old man. There, he's still suspected of murdering his mother and urgently wanted by the police. When his restaurant manager contacts him, Satoru is initially under the impression that he can find safe shelter with him, but it turns out to be a trap, as the manager is in cahoots with the police. Airi rescues him from his predicament and hides him at her house, as she firmly believes in his innocence. The next day, Satoru searches for all the information about Kayo's disappearance he can find, and realizes that his actions did in fact have an impact on the future, albeit not enough. However, when the manager suspects Airi of hiding Satoru at her house, Satoru has to leave again and finds his next hiding spot under a bridge. As Airi is packing some things at her home to take to Satoru, she receives a frightening message on her phone, signed in Satoru's name. Suddenly, her room fills with dense smoke, and she is hit by a violent explosion. When Satoru arrives at Airi's burning house, he immediately runs inside to save her. She seems to be too heavy to carry for Satoru alone, but suddenly, the manager comes and helps him. In order to avoid Satoru running into the police, the manager takes over the last stretch to the door alone. Airi quickly slips her phone into Satoru's pocket before he flees out the back door. After Satoru reads the message on Airi's mobile, he immediately calls a former journalist colleague of his mother's and arranges a meeting with him. The man named Sawada informs Satoru about the official reports of the events of the kidnapping series from 1988. The act always had one thing in common. They framed Yuki as the perpetrator. Sachiko, who had now found out the true identity of the perpetrator, was likely murdered by the same man, so as not to reveal him. Later, Satoru and Airi meet again under the bridge, and Airi reveals that she suspects a man named Nishizonu to be behind the fire at her house. Suddenly, the police appear to find and arrest Satoru. As he is conducted to the car in handcuffs, he sees a man standing among the investigators who looks oddly familiar. Before entering the police car, Satoru knows he still has a mission to complete and manages to force a revival to the year 1988 through sheer force of will. He finds himself in the Science Center on the 28th of February, the moment when he had experienced his first déjà vu, and thus seemingly found himself back in the same timeline as the first time. Now, Satoru was given a third attempt to change the course of events. The next day at school, Kenya approaches Satoru about the strong change in character he had observed in him over the past few weeks. He promises to help him save Kayo. When Satoru and Kayo return home on the 2nd of March, they are once again surprised with a birthday party by their friends and spend a joyful day together. But to make sure things don't go the same as last time, Satoru briefly leaves his party to go to Yuki's house. He throws a stone through his window, thus providing Yuki with a reliable alibi, as the police will now be busy with him that evening. Satoru then goes after Kayo's mother, Akemi. He wants to push her down a flight of stairs, but is stopped at the last moment by Kenya, who makes him realize that there must be other ways than killing Akemi. So the two go back to the party, and Satoru explains his new plan to Kayo on the way home. He wants to kidnap her, with her consent, and take her to an old abandoned bus, where she's to hide for the next few days. On the second night in the bus, however, something sinister happens. An unknown man enters the bus. Kayo manages to hide until the stranger leaves again, but the incident leaves her shaken. March 3rd, Yashiro tells Satoru that he has informed the Youth Welfare Office about Kayo's disappearance, and they want to pay Kayo's mother a visit that same evening. However, the officials only find an empty house upon their visit. Back in the bus, Kayo asks Satoru to stay the night, as she is now afraid of the return of the mysterious intruder from the previous night. She points to a backpack and a cardboard box that seem to belong to the perpetrator. Looking at the contents, Satoru feels queasy as he immediately recognizes the kidnapper's tools. This means they are right now in the middle of the perpetrator's territory and the same spiral of crime. Satoru then decides to take Kayo home with him so that she can spend the night there in safety. March 4th, after Kayo's first homemade breakfast of her life, she finally goes back home to her mother, accompanied by Satoru and Sachiko. Akemi is furious about her daughter's disappearance, but in the middle of her tantrum, she's blindsided by the officials from the Child Welfare Services. When Akemi tries to drag Kayo to the police, she is suddenly stopped by her estranged mother. She begs her and apologizes for not supporting her more in her abusive relationship with her ex-husband, and afterwards, when she was suddenly a single mother to Kayo. Akemi and her mother fall into each other's arms crying, and her mother promises to take good care of her granddaughter Kayo. As they say goodbye, Kayo thanks Satoru for saving her life. Now that Kayo is safe, Satoru turns his attention to the next two victims of the kidnapping series. First, the girl from the neighboring school, Aya. Satoru follows Aya to find out about her behavior and daily routines, but in the process, he happens to run into his mother, and shortly after, his teacher Yashiro, who offers to drive them both home in his car with their heavy shopping bags. Satoru discovers a suspicious pile of lollipops in Yashiro's glove compartment, which the teacher tries to explain away with a cheap excuse. The next day, Satoru and his friends introduce themselves to Aya. She's suspicious at first, but Kazu is able to persuade her to take a look at their secret hiding place. Since Aya and Kazu seem to get along extremely well a few days later, Satoru feels that she is in good hands, and he can devote himself to the third victim, his classmate Hirami. Hirami tells Satoru that he had observed Misato being excluded by her classmates since the day she falsely accused Kayo of stealing. Seeing a potential new victim in the lonely Misato, Satoru follows her to the hockey rink, but loses her there after she apparently fails to return from the toilet. Instead, Satoru meets Yashiro, who tells him that Misato had just left the building. Just then, a van belonging to Yuki's family drives by. Satoru and Yashiro decide to chase the van in the car, but Yashiro suddenly reveals himself to Satoru as the real culprit. He deeply resents Satoru for constantly crossing his plans in the past couple of weeks, almost as if he knows the future. Therefore, Yashiro devised his revenge plan. He used Misato as bait to lure Satoru to the hockey rink and then into his car. Now his car is headed for a frozen lake. Yashiro gets out of the car and watches as it slowly sinks through the ice, while Satoru tries in vain to escape the rigged seatbelt. Satoru sinks into the icy water, and the beautiful moments of his life pass him by once more. In 2003, Satoru wakes up from a coma. His mother had taken care of his body every day for 15 years, so Satoru is now making rapid progress through intensive physiotherapy. But even though he is slowly regaining control of his body, his memory of what happened seems to have disappeared. But a visit from Kenya and Hirami helps him begin to slowly put the pieces of the puzzle of his past back together. Kayo also pays Satoru a visit a little later. She's now married to Hirami and carries their baby in her arms. And yet another old acquaintance of Satoru's could hardly wait to finally see him after his awakening from the coma, Yashiro, who is now a successful high-ranking politician under the false name Nishizono. He takes advantage of Satoru's memory lapses and plays the good old school teacher who pays his former student regular visits at the hospital. However, Satoru's memories of Yashiro's attempt to murder him and the kidnapping attempts of his school friends are slowly coming back to him. which Yashiro also quickly suspects. He leads Satoru in his wheelchair to the hospital roof, and there, once again, accuses him of having continuously thwarted his plans 15 years ago. He threatens Satoru with killing him, but Satoru knows that there is something preventing him from doing so. The mystery of how Satoru was able to divine and prevent Yashiro's plans back then. The anger, but also the fascination with Satoru are what gave Yashiro's life meaning over the past 15 years, and Satoru is sure that Yashiro will not harm him due to their strong connection. This suspicion is confirmed when Satoru tries to throw himself off the roof, and Yashiro catches him at the last moment. When Yashiro realizes that he really cannot live without Satoru, he starts crying, lets go of Satoru, and wants to throw himself off the roof as well. However, just before doing so, Yashiro discovers that Satoru's fall had been intercepted by Kenya and Hirami. Satoru had told his friends days earlier that his memory had fully returned and that Yashiro was the culprit behind the crimes. They had then hatched a plan together, and now the police were already on the roof, ready to arrest Yashiro for attempting to murder Satoru once again. A few years later, Satoru had finally managed to follow his passion and make it as a successful manga artist. One day, he goes for a walk after work and happens to meet Airi right under the bridge where the two of them were when Satoru, unbeknownst to him, had his very last revival so many years ago, which led him to save so many lives. Thank you for sticking until the end. Subscribe for more videos like this.